Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Abir Shamim, and I'm a research assistant with Making the Shift. Making the Shift is a social innovation lab dedicated towards transforming how we respond to youth homelessness. And the lab's focus lies in its efforts to use research and knowledge mobilization directed towards youth homelessness prevention and housing stabilization. Today, my colleagues and I are excited to host this webinar on the centralized shelter diversion program carried out in the Niagara region. To begin, we would like to address the lands this webinar is being held on. We understand many of the attendees are accessing the webinar from various regions. Our land acknowledgement is specific to Making the Shift's location at York University's Keele campus. Nevertheless, we encourage attendees to acknowledge the Indigenous lands they're attending from. For our land acknowledgement at York University, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the known as Tekaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, I would like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, David French. David has more than 20 years experience working with Canada's most vulnerable young people. David has a passion for developing programs and policy that meet their unique needs. David has a multifaceted work history with 15 years of provincial government experience and manager director level experience in community. His approach to policy and program development harnesses the wisdom and knowledge of those in community and the voices of young people, always seeking to find spaces for transformational policy and linkages between program and practice realities. David places a strong emphasis on how community and government can work together. In previous roles, he has led the development of implementation provincial policies and strategies, and since joining Away Home Canada, he has supported youth homelessness policy and practice development across federal, provincial, and municipal mandates. Without further ado, I will hand it over to David.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here, and I'm privileged to be in this space with not only yourselves as attendees, but our two presenters today. And I won't go into detail about them. Their bios speak for themselves. And what I want to share is that they've been welcomed into the space, and they're sharing the space with us as not only thought leaders, but strategic leaders in Canada. And they both have created a foundation for this work and an understanding for this work that as a policymaker and as a listener and as a collaborator, I've appreciated how palatable the content has become. And I think that in its nature needs to be sort of the focus for how we move this work forward. And so both Mike Lethby and Dr. Katrina Milaney cover a geographic area in Canada that is important to recognize, one from out west, one from out east, but yet their impact has been sort of felt across Canada and internationally. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn and share. There will be a time for us at the end to ask questions, to grill them from what they didn't cover in their presentations. I've got a couple heaters planned. So first, we're going to hear from Mike Lethby from Niagara region.
Helps if I unmute. Thanks, Dave. So the presentation we're going to be looking at is based on a 2-year study that we conducted at the RAFT based on our shelter diversion work, which we piloted in April 2019. And to start the presentation, basically the first bit will be kind of about the RAFT and our journey to shelter diversion, what shelter diversion is, and then we'll sort of finish off, look at some of the highlights that came out of the report. So to start here, this really just is to show you that the RAFT as an agency, I think has progressed quite naturally, and anyone who's running a youth shelter or shelter in Canada I imagine that your histories are similar to ours, and that, you know, we started off as a community response, as a drop-in center. We grew into become a shelter. We took on that responsibility in 2002. And then by 2007, we have expanded from a 4-bed shelter to a 24-bed shelter. And I think that's a fairly natural progression for the agencies in the space. What kept us growing in that way was basically every time we would open a new shelter or add beds, we'd always end up being at capacity, which sort of necessitated the continued growth of the program. So 2007, 24 beds at capacity again. And so we had to sort of look at doing things a little bit differently. And that's when we started our first prevention program, Youth Reconnect, which started in 2008. And since we've been running that program, we've seen the 70% decrease in youth accessing the shelter. However, it wasn't enough to end the shelter entirely. We still ended up having 130 to 160 unique youth continuing to access the shelter every year, despite the fact that Youth Reconnect was moving. Next slide, please. So here's just a graph. I think it's quite informative. The blue bars are the unique individuals staying with us, where the red line across is the number of bed nights that those unique individuals generated. So you can see how we started off. And then in 2007, 2008, like I said, that's when we moved to the larger shelter, and you can see a corresponding increase in the number of individuals we were serving, quite drastic actually. And so we topped out between 2000 and 2008, almost at 500 unique individuals. And so this is when we started our Youth Reconnect program, and you can see that it started to have an effect immediately. And as we rolled it out from 2008 on, we slowly expanded. So we started in one community in Niagara, and then we were able to slowly roll it out so that by 2012, the program was actually accessible across every community in Niagara. So there's 12 municipalities in Niagara, and that's when we were able to service all 12 municipalities. And you can see we had a very, very steep decline in our usage after we were able to roll out the program, and we had the bed nights sort of followed the individual. Now in 2015, you'll notice, you can see where we started to hit a plateau on our beds. So we had the same number of unique individuals, despite the fact that we had rolled the program out. But the red line, you'll notice in 2015 actually started to increase. That's actually the beginning of the affordable housing crisis in Niagara. That was our first blush with it. And you can see that although we had fewer youth in the shelter than we had in 2007, 2008, our bed nights actually were approaching the same level as they were when we had, 70% more people using our shelter. So we had to sort of look at things, and this is when we really started to explore other programs, other interventions that we could bring forward in order to decrease that. And you can see how, starting in 2018 and then more drastically through 2019 to now, we've been able to make impact on that number, both in the number of bed nights drastically, but also 2020 was our lowest use year since we started, all the way back to the point where we were a 4-bed shelter. So, that's very interesting, and that's part of what we're talking about today on the shelter diversion. Next slide, please. So really, starting in 2018, one of our biggest sort of is the way we approached housing change. We really focused on housing and sort of rededicated ourselves to housing. And we also took a bit of a different look at it based on what we were seeing and the conversations we were having in the shelter. And so I think this is something that's largely missed in the affordable housing debates. We really focus on the physicality of housing. However, I do think it's worth noting, as it says on the slide, that the majority of young people up to the age 30 live at home. And so that's also been increasing since the 70s. So that means that if we don't look at family, and by family I mean larger than just mom and dad, kin, so cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. We really should be looking at them not only as family but also as affordable housing. And so they are the largest affordable housing for this age group in North America. So to not bring them into the conversation means that we start by taking the largest provider of affordable housing off the table, right at a time when affordability is such an issue. And so by refocusing, by addressing family and thinking in the affordable housing lens, we started to see our numbers decrease. Next slide, please. So now that's a little bit of the history of the RAFT, where we are and where we were. And now what we're really going to do is sort of walk a little bit through how we got to shelter diversion. And so just like to start off by thanking Argus House in Cambridge. I saw a presentation that they gave back in 2018 where this is the first time I'd heard of shelter diversion as a program. And some of the things they were seeing, their first year, I believe this was the first year, this was like a first year review of a 2-year pilot they were doing. And already just the similarities in population that they were seeing to what we were seeing, and then the results that they were able to achieve in that first year were so impressive. And so I contacted them, and they were great. They opened up their door to their program, and they actually allowed us to embed a staff. Once I was able to receive some funding to start the program, we were actually able to have a staff in bed with Argus for a week to basically learn how to run this program. So there's just a phenomenal agency that really opened its door, and the success we've had today with this program, we could not have achieved without the help of Argus at the very beginning. So just phenomenal work there. Thank you. So the shelter diversion program, really, the key here is it's not about saying no to shelter. It's really about saying what else. And so that's really what this program's about. It's not about simply trying to keep people out of shelter. It really is about saying, shelter's here for you, but if you have any other accommodation that's safe and appropriate, what can we do to get you there? And so it's based on, it's a strength-based interview. And I think that's important. I find a lot of our assessments in this sector tend to actually focus on deficits and problems that people have, needs. And really, the thing I really love about this program model, it really does say, we know you've been successfully housed in the past. What were the conditions that led to that successful housing, and what changed from there? So, it really does focus on the fact that you have been successful, and we know you can be successful. And so now we're just going to work with you to get you back to that success. So it really is, I believe, a strength-based and empowering process to go through, as opposed to sort of cataloging all these potential deficits or problems that you may have, and then trying to work that through. So I think it kind of flips it on its head and is truly strength-based. So we received some funding from a private funder, and then after working with the region of Niagara, once we saw some of the successes we were having, the region actually came on board and was able to fund the program and the expansions that we've had to date. Next slide, please. And so working with the region, we met with the region. So at the get-go, when we started the program in April 2019, the region of Niagara and I would sit down monthly and review the data that was coming out of the project. And basically that allowed us to have a third-party evaluator on site. It wasn't just what I was reporting to the region saying this is the program. They had full access to our data, and monthly we reported to them on what we were seeing, and then we did a lot of problem solving with the region as well to ensure that the program was achieving its maximum potential. And I'm quite happy to say that within the first 6 months, we were able to divert 40% of the youth accessing our RAFT shelter. And based on that success, and because there was some willingness in the community and some of the other shelters to become involved in shelter diversion, in 2019, or November of 2019, Southridge Community Church runs Niagara's largest adult shelter, 55 beds. And they partnered, and so we worked with them, and they became part of the team. And then we were able to do a third expansion in August of 2020 with the other youth shelter in Niagara, the Boys and Girls Club Niagara's Nightlight Youth Shelter, which is based in Niagara Falls. And so we were able to bring them on, without adding additional staffing capacity. So we were able to, between the 2 employees that are in this program, we were able to add, another 8-bed shelter to the service delivery without requiring additional resources. So that was amazing. The other key thing here is, if you notice, August 2020 was pretty much, we were newly into the pandemic, and we were able to launch this program successfully through the pandemic. So I think that's just speaks to the utility and ease of this kind of program. So that's, I think, one of the biggest things about this program that is really good. And that proves it right there, that you can expand during a pandemic when we had no face-to-faces. And so the data then for this report is really RAFT data for 2 years, April 2019 through to April 2021. Southridge data starting in November of 2019 through to April 2021, and then Nightlights data started in August 2020 through to April 2020. So all in, the data set contains the every time someone tried to access our services during those time windows, and that was 1,181 individuals over the course of this study. Next slide, please. And so I included this. This is something, it's something I think is somewhat overlooked or not recognized, or but I think it's a critical component to how to build a prevention program. And that really is understanding the role that homelessness is more than just a physical condition. It can also become an identity for people. And so there's quite a bit of research. I chose to provide where I found this research began, and that's with the David Snow and Leonard Anderson's identity work among homeless in '97, and then built upon by the Homelessness and Strategies of Identity Maintenance in '99. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's there, but really the point of this slide is really, and the theory behind it is that there are people who enter our shelters, and through spending time in our shelters, and the longer they spend in shelters, the more likely they are to assume a homeless identity, which kind of replaces whatever identity they had prior to coming in. So, quite a few of our the people that come into our shelter were students immediately before coming into our shelter. Well, that student identity tends to get lost over time, and this new homeless identity tends to replace it. And it's then that homeless identity which becomes a barrier to housing for them, because it's sort of antithetical to housing. So if you believe yourself to be homeless and that's now your identity, even if we end up finding you appropriate accommodation, housing no longer really matches your identity, and so you actively break down your housing to sort of make your identity agree with your physical condition. And so one of the things that just to keep this updated, recently on a podcast, the On the Way Home podcast that I'm sure everyone has listened to, Dr. Erin Day was describing in her recent podcast, was talking about one of the people in her research study that with lived experience and described this idea of putting on a second skin and then not being able to take it off after time. And so I think that's probably one of the best ways to describe what this idea of homeless identity formation is. And also just to update for you, if the people, you're interested in the literature review, there's a recent article in the Journal of Youth Studies by doctors Bill O'Grady, Sean Kidd, and Stephen Gates called Youth Homelessness and Self-Identity, A View from Canada, which is very much a current review of this homeless identity formation premise. So, I would direct if you're looking to sort of have a better understanding of prevention or how to develop a prevention program, I think having an understanding of this premise is critical to that. Next slide, please. So now we're kind of getting into the results. That's sort of how we got here, formation of the concepts that I had. and then how we end up being able to roll the program out. So of the 1,181 unique individuals, all those people ended up generating 2,643 interactions, and so that's the basis of this report. We had 379 youth, 800 adults, so almost double the number of adults, which fits within the Niagara region. Demographically, that would be what we would expect. And then the majority were male. And again, given the characteristics of the shelter system, that also agrees with what we would expect. One thing to note here, there were no family shelters involved in this study, so I'm making no comment when it comes to family diversion. This is strictly about individuals being diverted, primarily youth and primarily male. So just as a caveat when you're considering the findings here. Next slide, please. And so one of the interesting, probably one of the biggest takeaways for us was the new to accessing shelter versus people who've already had experience with shelter. And so only 22% of people trying to access shelters in that time frame of the three of us, the three shelters that were involved, only 22% were new to seeking shelter. By far, the largest percentage of people were people who had previously already had spent time in shelter. And so I think that's a critical takeaway, especially when we're thinking about who our clients are and what services we're delivering, and then ultimately how successful we have been in delivering services to our client. If 80% require more than one service, so it speaks to maybe we need to readdress and rethink how we're delivering services. And again, it just speaks to how difficult it is, as you can read there, once you're involved in the system, in leaving the system. And so of that group, the 61% were youth, had already had one experience in shelter. Is interesting too if you consider that our youth cohort reflect an 8-year window where that could have been true. So from 16 through to 24. And so we're not talking over a lifetime of decades where you might have had a need to access shelter at one point in your past and then come forward. It's, this is, a fairly tight time frame. Next slide, please. And here's the just a breakdown of where people, or the reason people gave for accessing shelter. If you go to page 10 of the report, I break down these categories as to what they all mean. But you can really see, risk of homelessness, actually on the street, service outflows, coming from other services, including shelters, relationship breakdown. And so it gives you a bit of a sense of where things are at. One thing as we move forward to consider here, when I look to judge the prevention work and how well the prevention program is going, I look at two things really. One is how many people did we actually divert from shelter or prevent from needing to access shelter? But two, how many of the people that we had an intervention with that was successful remained successful over the longer term? So we're going to kind of look at the first part of that now. Next slide, please. And so overall, our success rate was 17%, 461 individuals we were able to successfully divert from shelter. That percent, when we break it into youth and adult, we were more successful with youth at 36% and 11% for adults. And this actually pretty much mirrors almost exactly what Argus was able to report in their shelter diversion program, which leaves a lot of credibility to the fact that this model, if we maintain fidelity with the model, is portable to other communities. There are factors, however, that if we digged into the numbers a little deeper, there are some factors that shifted and allowed us to achieve greater levels of success. And that was if someone was new to shelter, if they had greater personal agency, and then obviously the unique versus repeating. So someone who's never had access to shelter versus the people who have had multiple access to shelter. Next slide, please. And so this graph just sort of illustrates the new to shelter and what we were able to achieve when we isolated out people who were successfully housed versus unsuccessfully housed or diverted based on whether or not they've never accessed shelter before or had accessed shelter in the past. So for both youth and adults, you can see that we had greater success, much greater success than baseline if they were new to shelter than if they were not new to shelter. Next slide, please. And this is again, on page 10 of the report, there's a breakdown as to what these categories mean, but risk of homelessness and relationship breakdown. In risk of homelessness, we're talking about people that aren't necessarily on the street, but are likely to end up on the street for some reason. And so they're still in a place where they have some agency, some personal agency, some ability to make choices. And so that's largely the risk to homelessness, where when we defined lesser personal agency, this was really a group that their personal agency had really been decreased because their situation has been decreased. So they are currently on the street, or they're accessing, or they're transitioning out of a service into another service. So, and you can see the differences in the how successful we were based on that. So that's sort of how personal agency sort of played into our data. Next slide, please. And then this I found particularly illustrative. This is for looking at youth, where we looked at the unique number of youth versus the repeating in the total population. And then we looked at how many of the repeating, how many more interactions repeating created over unique. And so you can see for youth, we had the 67% were unique, where 33% were repeating. However, it flips when we look at who generates the number of interactions, where the repeating generated by far the majority of interactions, where the youth were, or the uniques were less than half. And then our success. So if they were unique, we had greater level of success. With the ununique, the people who were repeating, we were less successful in our diversion. Next slide, please. And so this is the second part that I was sort of mentioning about when I look at a prevention program, was not only how well does the program itself divert at the first instance that we have an interaction, but is there a longer term effect? And so with youth, we were able to determine that if we were able to successfully divert you the first time, 74% of those youth didn't end up coming back for a second interaction. So, and that becomes really important over the longer term, especially when we're looking at the role that repeat users use and or have in the shelter, and also the longer term, like as people age into chronicity. And so this is, the fact that we were able to keep that through one diversion attempt, not only did it divert the initial instance of homelessness, but people were able to stabilize in the community and not have to enter the system for additional supports. Next slide, please. And so why all this is important, kind of wrapping it up, there's this concept of the flywheel, sort of made famous, I think, by Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, where he talks about this flywheel. In his case, he's talking about how a business builds a flywheel and they want it to spin faster, and that's good for them. But in fact, in our world, it kind of flips the other way. What we want to do is we want to slow that flywheel down. And so anytime someone enters the shelter system, that speeds up the flywheel. And you get more and more repeat users who end up getting caught in the system, and that keeps the flywheel spinning. And so really what prevention and shelter diversion, what we're looking to do is, by diverting people from entering the system in the first place, we're also reducing the number of people who will then repeatedly need the system over the longer term. And so this then allows us to start slowing the flywheel down, which allows the shelters then the breathing room to be able to do the social work that's required for the people who need that extra support. And so what this also allows is that once a shelter hits overcapacity, the ability for us to really do the housing work starts to fall apart. And we sort of default to rule like security, rule enforcement, which then further degrades our trusting relationships with the people we're trying to serve. So by limiting the number of people that come in the shelter, that allows us to focus our resources on the housing side, which in fact creates better trust, which then furthers our success, as opposed to letting the shelter become overwhelmed and then staffing having to sort of default to security, which then further breaks down trust. And ultimately, we see that repeating cycle, the flywheel spinning faster. And this sort of answers the question, I think, on why adding shelter beds seems to increase the number of homeless. Well, it's because every time we increase the beds, we increase the flywheel, especially if we're not doing anything on either side. If we're not doing any prevention work, or we're doing after supports to help stabilize people in community. If our response continues to be just adding beds, we're really just creating more homelessness. Next slide, please. And so just in summary then, and again, all of these are captured on the last page of the report. So if you want a bit more of a detailed overview, these are the sort of my primary learnings from the work we were doing. One, that it's an effective program and that the benefits are cumulative. So that's where the flywheel conversation comes in. The concept of homeless identity, this wearing of a second skin that is required in order to survive in the system, and what that means for our ability as service providers or people who are looking to help, what that means to our efforts and sort of how we can become short-circuited in our efforts because of that. And also our role in creating that. So, I mean, there's a high level of responsibility that us as service providers or us as people looking to help have to accept in what we've contributed to how the system currently operates. If we can reduce the number of people, we can reduce the number of people who are repeatedly accessing shelter, ultimately impacting chronic homelessness. Assessments and all our services really should be strength-based and respectful. I think that's a key takeaway. And that's one of the things I really like about the shelter diversion, as the Argus model has shown. It really is a strength-based successful. I think that largely is one of the reasons why it is successful. It's relatively easy and inexpensive to operate. I mean, if I was looking now and I wanted to start a prevention work and I wasn't exactly sure where I was going to start with prevention, shelter diversion, well, maybe not the biggest bang for the buck when it comes to percentages. Like, for example, Youth Reconnect had a massive reduction in our shelter usage. However, it was a much more complicated program requiring many more partners. Shelter diversion, really, if you can afford to hire on a staff and train them in the model, you can see these kind of results. And in fact, one worker, because the capacity is there, I would suggest that working with partners, you could basically share staffing and be able to spread shelter diversion even farther, which is why it's inexpensive compared to other programs. Again, this leads to that centralized team. A lot of benefits in the centralization. Also, I think there's a responsibility here. I think if I was going to say anything, that's probably would be my biggest reason for arguing for a centralized team is anytime you put a potential barrier at the door, when you have someone that's standing in the way of service, although unintentional, we want to make sure that that person is the best trained person possible with the best level of experience. So, the centralized team, having someone dedicated that this is what they're doing, this is their job. I think that's critically important, because we never want to start a program where the potential for harm occurs. And anytime we work with people in the human services, we have to accept the fact that our efforts, however unintentional, can create harm. And we should do everything we can to mitigate against that. And because shelter diversion is such a nuanced program, I highly recommend that you have dedicated staffing for it, where this is their only responsibility. And that they, in addition, that they are not just someone with no experience. This isn't a sort of an entry-level position, but this position really should be someone with who you trust and has significant level of experience working with the system. And then finally, the cost effectiveness of this, sort of going back to the other comment, the fact that one worker is enough, for a shelter of 55 beds, and we were able to add extra capacity to that without adding additional staffing, means that it is fairly cost effective as a prevention service. And it's a great program because you can bring in partnerships and utilize that staffing resource over a larger cohort of people, larger shelters. And so, in communities that maybe, where you're really trying to maximize your prevention homeless dollars, I think shelter diversion really achieves that goal for you. And so that's sort of the end of my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. And we can seamlessly transition to Dr. Milaney.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So my role in today's presentation is a little bit different. I'm a researcher from the University of Calgary. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about a project that we are launching with Mike and his team and 4 other youth serving agencies across Canada to just take a much deeper dive into diversion and how we should be doing it and what the impact is. And so just to give you a little bit of background and context, making the shift put out a call for research projects. And one of their biggest areas of priority is in homelessness prevention. And prevention is typically a fairly nebulous kind of idea. It's hard to sort of grasp what prevention is. And so, this is really important and really impactful that now we sort of have this national movement that is looking specifically at prevention. And so I do quite a lot of work in homelessness and poverty and substance use with a number of community agencies here in Calgary. And I was approached, when this call came out, I was approached by an organization in Calgary called Trellis, which is formerly the Boys and Girls Club. And what's interesting to me when I listened to Mike's story is Trellis, as an organization, was going through the exact same process in their own way here in Calgary. And so they have a shelter for youth, and they, went through a period of time where they continually had to increase their shelter capacity to deal with the what seemed like a very big increase in homelessness for youth. And they came to a point in their work, just building again on something that Mike said, where they had to start questioning, are we doing the right thing by opening our doors and welcoming everyone in? And obviously that's a compassionate approach and an important approach when people are unsafe or at risk. And so they did get to that same point where they started thinking, can we do something differently? Can we shift the paradigm a little bit more towards upfront work? How can we change our practices, build relationships with people at that first phone call or at that first visit to shelter, and see if we can find alternatives for them? And so Trellis went through the exact same process. They started shifting the roles of their staff, started spending a lot of time around working with youth to find alternatives to shelter stays. I'm sure many of you know that once someone is in homelessness, their risk of exploitation, their risk of violence is very high. And so, and particularly with young people, it was really important for staff at this organization to start to think, maybe we can do something differently. And so they implemented this diversion program, and they came to me and said, Katrina, I think it's working. We think it's working. We're seeing that many of these youth that were doing this for upfront work are not coming back to shelter. And so, but we really want to understand if that is the case, if they're just going somewhere else, or if we really are onto something in terms of long-term prevention of homelessness. So we put in this grant to do this study in Calgary. And what I loved about making the shifts approach is typically as a researcher, when you put in for a grant, a committee reviews all the grants, they score you, they rank you, and the top 10 get funded and the rest don't. What they did, which is so thoughtful and forward thinking, was they looked at our proposal, They liked the idea, and they knew that there were other organizations across Canada that were working in shelter diversion. And so they got back to us and said, would you be interested in doing this in multiple cities instead of just in one city? And of course, we said, yes, we would love to do that. And so we do have 3 years to do this study. We are working with Mike's organization and several other organizations in Guelph, Cambridge, Peterborough, and Calgary. We are proposing to do an ethnographic case study, recognizing that each organization is doing things probably a little bit differently. There's definitely going to be some commonalities, but we don't have a fulsome picture yet of how everybody is sort of working in this space. What are the key components of their programs? What kinds of data are they collecting? What kinds of outcomes are they seeing? So we're going to do a case study in each city and get a really good idea of how the program model is implemented in those cities. And then we're going to implement several data collection approaches to really, like I said, take a deep dive in terms of what's happening. And so we're looking at the effectiveness of these shelter diversion programs. We're looking at how can we develop, like Mike said, a program model that has fidelity in terms of, these are the key components that are really critical to have in place, but also recognizing that we probably need some adaptability in that each of these organizations in each of these cities have their own local context, different partnerships, potentially different issues that they're grappling with. So can we develop a model that is adaptable, but still has some fidelity at the core of it? The other piece that I think is really important as we're understanding how these models are operating, doing an evaluation of their impact. And it's an impact evaluation, but it's also a process evaluation. And what all that means is, we want to take a really critical look at not just what is happening and what the outcomes are, but how it's happening. So who are the partners? What relationships need to be in place? What types of data collection tools do we need? What types of interventions do we need? In addition to what's happening with these youth and their families once they go through the diversion program. So there's two primary components to it. Like I said, the research piece and then an evaluation piece. And what that will help us do is understand, are we defining shelter diversion in the right way? Do we need to make some adaptations to the concept, to the ideas? And we're going to create usable tools, which will be toolkits we'll create webinars, training opportunities for staff, so that any organization who wants to start to shift towards shelter diversion and homelessness prevention has the tools and the information that they need to do so. So it is an ethnographic approach, which just means we have multiple data collection approaches that we're going to take up. We're going to look at the data from each of those sites. What are they currently collecting? What types of questions are they asking? What outcomes are they showing? And see if we can start to think about a way to create some shared data tools, some shared data questions, specifically for the diversion program. We're going to be doing interviews with staff who are working in these agencies, getting their perspectives, particularly around the paradigm shift. So what needed to happen in your organization, or what was happening in your organization that led you to this place that you needed to make a big shift? And so how can we capture that sort of process that organizations went through and create information that other organizations can use if they are sort of grappling with these same kinds of tensions or grappling with what a paradigm shift could look like. We're going to do surveys. We're going to do baseline surveys with youth and a sample of interviews with youth, and hopefully with members of their families, so we can get a really good sense of what is the context of the relationship in these families. What are the situations, the issues, where are the strengths, what are the key components that we can implement to start from, like Mike said, that strength-based approach, and build on that. And not only sort of as we are first meeting youth and families, but because we have 3 years to do this study, we want to connect with them over time and see what's changed. And that is the piece that will really give us a sense of, how many youth are actually being prevented from homelessness, how many are being successfully diverted. And again, the interviews and the surveys will give us more information about the how and the why of that. So we're going to meet with youth and families quarterly over that 3-year period. And then, of course, many of you know that there is a national database called HIFIS. Is there something that we can glean from HIFIS? Is there some information that we can use to inform HIFIS in terms of, again, that shared data collection approach that really, this project, I think, is a really great sort of pilot to understand how you do this nationally. And so, it is really exciting to think about the potential. And so, so we're asking, what is the program model that works? How does it work? Why does it work? What are the similarities and differences in service delivery models? What are the longitudinal outcomes of youth who are successfully diverted? And what factors, what's happening in the context that are leading to positive and or negative outcomes, recognizing, of course, that, there may be youth who are not successfully diverted, and what is happening there that we can learn from to make tweaks and to make shifts. And I think really importantly, particularly when we talk about youth, different groups of youth are vulnerable or at risk for different reasons. And so how can we recognize the diverse identities and experiences of youth and build that into the program model? So for example, in Calgary, a large percentage of our youth in shelters are Indigenous youth. And so we are working with an elder circle that we meet with quarterly. We have an elder who works with us very regularly, and we will provide, Trellis already has connections to elders for youth who want that as part of their healing journey and part of their, and part of the way the program operates. And so all of this, in all of this, we have to be mindful of, the diverse experiences and identities of youth. And so how do we grapple with that as well? And so I'll just, next slide, please. I think in terms of the outcomes, the other piece that we're doing just as a small pilot here in Calgary is actually engaging with some youth who we were not able to successfully divert. So what is going on in their lives that is preventing them from that sort of family reunification or natural supports model being effective for them. So I think that, having those sort of two sides of the story are opportunities for us to be really reflective and critical about what are the strategies that need to be in place. And this isn't just about the program model, right? Recognizing that there are policies in place that sometimes can create barriers to good service delivery or effective service delivery, whether it's the way we fund programs or sort of gaps or silos between different systems like the child welfare system, the justice system, education. What role do those systems have to play in terms of the broader conversation around prevention? And so we will be thinking about the policies that potentially need to be shifted or changed. So those are big outcomes right there. But again, I think the purpose of this is not research for research's sake, right? It's not going to be accessible to just other academics or other researchers. It really is about creating very practical hands-on tools, toolkits, like I said, webinars, training opportunities to take this nationally and to see if we can actually make a dent in the national story of youth homelessness prevention, particularly through diversion and natural supports. So that is our hope and our dream, and the fact that we have amazing people like Mike who are national leaders in this work, and as well as our partners in our other cities. And 3 years to do this is an absolute gift, because most of the time, as many of you know, we sort of do these point in time projects, which tell us a lot, but don't tell us much after the 6 months or the 12 months that the funding lasts. And so because we have 5 cities across Canada, and because we have amazing partners who have such expertise in this work already, and because we have 3 years to do this, I'm really excited about the potential to really have a national impact, and potentially, because of making the shifts, networks beyond Canada. So that's it for me. I'll stop there and I will turn it back over to David.
Thank you. I've got the questions up. I'm excited about getting to those. But what I wanted to share too, with respect to the collective work that's happening here is sort of our responsibility and our obligation back to partners across Canada, internationally, who are wanting to engage in this work. And in partnership with Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Projects, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and ourselves, Away Home Canada, we're really working and focusing on what does this mean to build capacity at the front line. And we're doing that in a number of different ways. And I don't want anybody to think that when we speak to frontline, we're thinking about people who are just delivering this work. There's important capacity building opportunities here from a leadership perspective, from a strategic perspective, but also from a board perspective. You know, Katrina spoke to the paradigm shift, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, but those are moments where at a board level or organizational strategic level, you are met with these opportunities to take a new route. So how can we as an organization support you with the elements that are necessary to move in this direction? And these are just some examples, and I'll go into our process in a minute, but we're offering now training, case consultation, peer knowledge opportunities through communities of practice. And of course, we've always had these tools, guides, and reports. And so you can expect the same kind of mix of opportunities that come out from underneath this shelter diversion study and the work that we're engaged in with Mike from the RAFT. And what this means for you as service providers on the ground, next slide, please, is that we're going to be able to get into what is this new sort of vision for Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory is our training and technical assistance process. In that many of you are probably thinking to yourselves, we need to be trained on how to do shelter diversion. And the answer is yes, you do. But what we have now as an organization is a training process. In that in many circumstances, we were delivering training to community organizations. We weren't necessarily assessing all of the needs of a community before we entered that community to deliver that training. So we weren't doing all the work around systems, around stakeholders, around the complexities of accepting a new program model or a new program into your organization. So that's really about readiness. And so we want to support you to be able to do that and give you that lead time so you're really ready for training. Engage in the training piece, so give you the tools, but then also support you with the implementation of that. And so not go away. In many ways, the real challenge with implementation is when you get into sort of really complex scenarios, when you get into challenges with stakeholder partners, and we want to be able to continue to support that. And so our new TTA process is really going to sort of embodied in this opportunity is to share growth opportunities for community organizations. And we're going to use that same process as we unpack the learnings from the shelter diversion study and these opportunities moving forward to take this as a program model, much like we've delivered training on other program models, Housing First for Youth, Family and Natural Supports, the Youth Assessment and Prioritization Tool. Shelter diversion will be another program model tool that will be able to provide communities to ensure that you have everything you need to move in this paradigm moment and to take that leap towards this work, because it's important that you have the opportunities and the tools to be able to do that safely, to do that with not only approval from your organization, but also do that holistically with your community. Because as we'll probably get into, and as Mike spoke to it, this was more than just an organizational change to move into shelter diversion. This was a community opportunity to change the way they worked with young people. Next slide. So this is our opportunity for questions. And I know that, I don't know, Katrina and Mike, if you're into the Q&A field, but we've got a series of them now. And so I'll leave mine for a bit later and see if we get into them. But the first one speaks to, can you speak to the screening tool and process that you're using to speak that focus on the entry points for this? Maybe Mike, could you address that?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So the screening tool is the tool that we borrowed from Argus, so it's the Argus tool that we use. If anyone's interested, I can absolutely share it. But it isn't like a popular tool that is in the community or you can just download. It really was, as far as I know, developed by Argus, and that's the tool we adopted. The entry point is anytime anyone contacts any of the shelters to access a bed. And so what happens at that point is when someone tries to access one of the beds, then they're directed to speak with shelter diversion worker who then uses the tool with the person. And it really does sort of, ask about what your successes have been, where were you housed a month ago, and then are there things we can do to, help you back to that success. Just as sort of an example of shelter diversion access. Say you've moved to a city because you have a new relationship, and then the relationship falls apart, but you can't necessarily that night go home because it's you don't have the money to get there. It's quite a distance, and so in the past you may then have to access a shelter as your alternative. And so what shelter diversion in that case would do would we'd understand, oh, okay, so you do have somewhere you can go, you just for whatever reason physically can't go there tonight. Well, what happens if we pay for the taxi, or what happens if we, with your permission, contact the person on the other end to make sure that this is a place you can go and that it'd be safe for you, and then we just facilitate that. And so, instead of having a person have to spend some time in shelter and sort of work their own way to get back to that place, we can just do it immediately. And so that's just sort of an example of how we interact at that moment of intake.
Excellent. Do you have anything to add, Katrina, in your early research?
Not much, really. I mean, I think the process is really similar here in Calgary. And, one of the first questions that staff are asking is there any place that you can go that's safe for you? Mm-hmm. And if there is, how can we get you there? And what supports? I think the second piece of that they spend a lot of time in is what supports can we put in place with that family member or with that household to potentially keep you there, right? So it's sort of this multi-phase, but the first question is often, is there some place that you can go and how can we help you get there?
Excellent. And this next one, I think, probably both of you can speak to it given your experience in the sector. And next question is, do you think diversion can fit into a housing first assistance system? So I'm thinking within a housing first continuum. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually a critical component to delivering a good, successful housing first program. What it does, again, it's that flywheel. So housing first is working on the other side of the wheel, trying to stabilize people after they become chronically homeless. And so, again, if we can slow the flywheel down, then that'll ensure that on the other side, the people that are doing the other side of the work, the housing stabilization with chronically homeless, are able to more effectively, because there'll be less people requiring their services, which then allows for more resources to be dedicated to the people who have become chronically homeless. So I think without a diversion program, we're really putting in jeopardy our ability to successfully run a housing first program.
I agree. The one piece that I would add is we do see it actually in other sectors, often in the domestic violence sector. One of the questions that are asked in those shelters is, again, is there some place that you can go that is safe for you? So I do see it happening in pockets in other places, but could this sort of model be applied for particularly any age group? Absolutely.
Excellent. Cost savings. I mean, you spoke a bit to it, Mike, but can you cite some real examples?
Yeah. So really, the cost savings is going to be a future savings. So the problem with any prevention work, and what really sort of hamstrings prevention work, is that the savings are actually farther down the pipe. And oftentimes you have to start prevention as an additional cost on the outside at the inset, at the beginning, because you still have to run your shelter. So what we have been able to see some savings is obviously the reduced capacity in shelter. So directly there's just some upfront savings when we're not, food bills and that sort of thing. Really the benefit, the real cost savings would come when we can start to consolidate shelters because we won't need as many beds. But the real problem there on the cost saving side, if we're just struggling at cost savings, is the disruption to the system when look to close shelter. And so that's an area that requires obviously some finesse. But on the other side, if you want to look at a programming cost savings, what I was speaking about how one staff is actually probably has a greater capacity than what your shelter is. And so if you could bring in other community partners, other shelters, like we did where, we were able to have the 2 staff without any additional staff, we were able to bring in a third party, the third shelter, Nightlight Shelter, in without any increase in resources. So I'd say that's a fairly significant savings to the system that we were able to expand that way. So, really depending on how you want to look at it, there are angles of cost savings, and some of them are fairly immediate, but I think it's just how quickly you can get this up for very few dollars, and its applicability across the system is probably the biggest.
I'll maybe just throw in a super quick example, because this is a story that stuck with me. Before I came to the university, I worked in community agencies, and I did a lot of work with women and children. And so this isn't necessarily about youth homelessness, but I was asking this mom, she was considered, her family was considered at risk. And I said, what do you need? Like, what do you need? And she said, I have 2 kids that have been taken from me. Each of them is in a different family, and each of those families is getting paid $1,400 to look after my kids. She said, what if instead somebody paid a social worker, that money to come into my home and help us as a family do all the things that we need to do to be together as a family? And that story, I still get goosebumps and it was like probably 15 years ago that I had that conversation, but it sticks with me because what would be different, right? Like, not only would you save money in terms of potentially keeping those kids out of other systems down the road, including child welfare, but also what about the outcomes for that family? Like staying in school, healthy relationships, sort of breaking some of those cycles that many families go through. Mm-hmm. So that one story is something that really sticks with me in terms of, yes, there's a cost savings for sure, but there's a bigger picture outcomes that are far more impactful, I think.
Yeah, the larger system impacts are significant there, given that one example. Further expansion, Mike, there's a question here around your opportunities for that.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is making sure that the data is good and that we can actually, show the successes and that the successes are real. So that's the first part of, before we think about expansion, is really being sure that what we're doing is successful. And really, it's a community effort at this point. So, I mean, I would love to see this program being offered across the Niagara region, that every shelter, before someone enters shelter, they would have an opportunity to speak with a diversion worker, and that really becomes the first point of contact for the system. However, it's a partnership. So we're working together now with our region to look at what the future could be for the program, but we're also working with the partners to make sure that we understand what we're doing and that we are, bringing forward the best possible programs and solutions. So, like I said, if I could have my way, we would expand across Niagara, but it's a system. It isn't just one agency or one person. So that's where we're looking.
Excellent, thank you, Katrina. Your research, is it going to focus on probably, and I'm maybe trying to paraphrase within the question, around the possible long-term trajectories in making the shift away from youth homelessness? So is it going to get at some of these larger system impacts of why young people are being driven towards shelter?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I saw that question as well, and I interpreted it as well as what are the other things that are happening in the stories of these youth beyond just preventing homelessness. So the, one of the gifts that we have in being able to connect with people quarterly over 3 years is we get to understand a little bit at least about the long-term impacts. And so what are the things in the youths and families' lives that are different because they avoided that situation of homelessness? And yeah, what are the other sort of, and there's always going to be unanticipated outcomes, right? You can't go into this thinking that you're going to know everything. So we will be very mindful of all kinds of, impacts outcomes in terms of trajectories for these youth and families.
Excellent, thank you. And the Argus screening tool, do you have permission to share that broadly, Mike, or should we loop back to Argus to ask for broader permission?
Yeah, we can share the tool. I don't physically I can't put it up on the screen, but if anyone wants to contact me, we'd have no problem sharing that tool.
Yeah. And I'm glad the question's been asked around coordinated access and how this would fit within a coordinated access system. Both of you can speak to that, I'm sure.
Yeah. I believe this program has an excellent synergy with coordinated access. One of the things, like, as an example, in a coordinated access, people aren't necessarily, sort of looking at what the best shelter may be for their particular, what city they're in, or maybe there's shelters that specialize in certain areas of service where a diversion worker would know that. So you got to remember, we were only successful with 17% of the total population, 40% for youth. But that meant that by far the majority of people actually accessed the shelter when they came looking for service. And so what the diversion worker in a coordinated access system could do is say, okay, well, we aren't able to divert. You do require shelter access. And then they can sort of say, well, you've contacted this shelter, but, based on our conversation now, I think, you may find a better fit at this shelter. And so that's one area where the diversion worker could help at the beginning of SIF and navigation to make sure that people are sort of accessing shelters in a way that's best for them and best suited to what they're looking for, be it the geography or what they're presenting with. Also, from the Housing First side, usually using the by names list, there's a list of people who potentially have sort of been pre-approved for service. However, it's now you have to find them, right? So when they enter the system, they've already been pre-approved. So the diversion worker being the first point of contact then, and working as a team, especially if it's a system-wide diversion, that means anybody trying to access any of the shelter goes through the shelter diversion team. And so what you could have is the list from the by names list of people who have been pre-approved for service. And then as soon as someone shows up trying to access shelter, they would know that this person's already pre-approved. They could let the person know, oh, by the way, you have been pre-approved in the service. So-and-so will be reaching out to you. And then as they move into the shelter itself, the shelter diversion worker can also update the shelter staff to say, this person has been approved. So instead of people sort of, spending time in the system and then being found out at later date sort of happenstance, this would really facilitate much direct service involvement and really create efficiencies in the system, and would also, for the people that have been pre-approved for additional resources, you can let them know up front that this is. So again, it takes away some of the anxiety and shows that the system is aware of you, knows about you, and wants to support you, and we're ready to support you. You just needed to come to us for the support. So, I think it could be a powerful tool in a coordinated access system.
Yeah.
And I think just to build on the Housing First piece, one of the big purposes of coordinated access is to coordinate the systems, right, between the shelters and the housing programs. And so if there will be some youth who we are not able to divert. And so how can we streamline access to housing programs as an alternative to shelter for some of those youth? And so, because we're doing this very small sort of sample in Calgary of youth who we weren't able to support with family reunification or natural supports, can we get them connected through coordinated access and connected to a service provider who could potentially pick up the housing piece? So that would a place where I could imagine coordinated access fitting.
Yeah, excellent. So I've got a couple questions, and they're sort of riffing off of both of your presentations. Katrina, to you first. Without revealing everything so far that you've learned, can you maybe cite some paradigm shifts where communities might be? Because maybe there are people who are listening to this right now and they think, hey, I think we're in a paradigm shift. Can you give us some examples?
Oh my goodness, you do ask tough questions. I think, you know, I can speak to the Calgary story. And, you know, when Calgary first started stepping into ending homelessness work in 2008, 2009, we very early recognized that approaches like particularly Housing First, you know, they may work for everyone, but they don't work in the same way for everyone. And we can't apply the same principles to housing for youth that we would, for example, for a 46-year-old man. So, so very early in the conversation in Calgary, we recognized that we needed a separate strategy specifically for youth. And what was great about that was the impetus behind it was Calgary's 10-year plan to end homelessness, which had lots of flaws. There's no such thing as perfect, but it very quickly became obvious to our youth serving agencies that what we were proposing in our plan to end homelessness was not going to work for youth. There was a very heavy focus on chronic homelessness, and our agencies told us, you know, you don't want youth. You don't want youth in chronic homelessness. You want to act fast. You want to avoid chronic homelessness. And a lot of our youth are moving through episodic homelessness, couch surfing, going to shelter, going home, back to someone's couch. And so prioritizing people in chronic homelessness means you're going to leave youth out completely. And so our agencies mobilized and said, we have to create our own strategy specifically to end youth homelessness. And that again was probably 2009, 2010. And for me, that was the sort of beginning conversation around the paradigm shift. I think we had a lot of buy-in, which towards the philosophy and the concepts of ending homelessness and Housing First. But there was quite a bit of pushback in our city in terms of, you know, who are you to say this is how we need to do it? We know what we need to do, and now you need to support us to do it. And so, you know, I can't say enough about the strength of the collaboration amongst our youth serving agencies to just stand up and say, you guys know, you need to listen to us. And so they created a plan to end youth homelessness. And it was specifically designed for the diverse and unique needs of youth, particularly youth who have very recent experiences of trauma and how you respond to that. So I really think it started with some conversations, and in a way, in our city at least, a bit of a backlash towards some of the work that was happening when agencies didn't feel like they were a part of it. So that paradigm shift started, and I really think just another shout out to our youth serving agencies is they didn't keep it local. They mobilized sort of nationally with other agencies across Canada working with youth and having these conversations around what are you guys grappling with? Like, how are you dealing with prevention? How are you dealing with Housing First? And they created this community of practice with a number of shelters across Canada that again, just sort of kept that paradigm shift moving forward. So it's really been an evolution. I think the conversations are very different now. I think it's much easier to take up these paradigm shifts, to get engaged in really innovative, forward-thinking prevention work, you know, in large part because of organizations like Mike's, who really just took a stand and stood up and said, we might be doing more harm than good here, and we need to start thinking about how to do it differently.
Love it. Mike, to you, you spoke to the staffing and the nuances and the changes that you experienced in what that looked like. And so can you maybe describe sort of the how that staffing model might have changed the dynamics of your organization and how you delivered? Was it kind of a broad staffing change, or was it you were looking now for a different type of person to deliver that work and the nature in which they were working themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we were very busy, and like I said, when we were over capacity often to the point where we were turning away people because we didn't have the beds, the way the work on the ground worked was very different from what we thought we were doing. And that's where I was saying, like, it really did come down to security. You know, you're trying to provide a safe place. And so, and suddenly that, you know, and it really degraded the level of trust, both between the people that are looking for the support. So what people thought they were coming into the shelter to receive, and then what they actually got when they were, you know, access the shelter. And then from our side, what, you know, I don't think many of the people who come into the human services come in because they're looking to be security guards. You know, they're coming in because they have that social work aspiration. They want to build trusting relationships. They want to see people succeed. But what they found, just like the people that were coming in the door, what the staff found when they came in is that largely, because we were over capacity, because there wasn't enough staff to really effectively provide the service we said we would provide, largely they became security guards. They made sure people ate. They tried to keep the building secure, and they tried to enforce, the rules that we hoped would keep people safe. And that just, it just really altered the relationships in the shelter. It altered how we did our mission. And in effect, it became unsafe, I think, largely, because that's the condition we were working in. And so when we were able to start reducing the number of people, when we moved to prevention, that gave the space in the shelter. And it did require us to hire different types of people. The people were always there. It's just, we were just asking them to do things that, they weren't really trained to do and had really no desire to do, but that ended up being the job. So, it's been amazing to see staff flourish when they're able to actually engage in an authentic way with the work that they wanted to do, as opposed to the work that we had to have them do in order just to, try to keep everyone safe. So, that's really the key piece. The people were always there. It's just the system, they just had to behave differently. But it's interesting how that worked on both ends, right? The service provider had to be different, and the people who were looking for service also ended up having to behave differently. And so that's really where, we tried to make a change and shift the paradigm that way.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Those are all my questions. Is there anything you want to leave us with, Dr. Milaney or Mike, before we turn it back to the MTS staff?
No, I think, it's been a great conversation, and I just want to express my gratitude to be able to play in this space and work in this really important work. And we're just getting started. So we're getting all our ducks in a row and figuring out how we do this ethically and safely with multiple partners and multiple cities with young people. And I'm a bit nervous. I think there's big risks associated with this kind of work, but I think there's huge opportunity. And I hope to be able to come back to you in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and be able to share some really amazing results and be able to talk really excitedly about a national impact in terms of supporting youth in better ways and healthy ways. So I'm just really excited and thankful.
Mike.
Yeah, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be working in this space, to be in a position where we can try something different, challenge existing norms. And it's always amazing, like thinking back to that first relationship with Argus, just how wonderful they were about really, opening their doors to us. I mean, I think that's really what makes the whole not-for-profit sector successful, is the fact that, those kind of relationships can exist in the sector. And so I can, it's really the partner and the people working on the ground doing the work that are really making this change happen. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to, the partners I don't know yet.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. On behalf of MTS Away Home and the Canadian Observatory, I want to thank both Dr. Milaney and Mike, and really true stellar examples of leaders who come at this work with a level of openness and with a level of vulnerability that allow us to learn and create space in the conversation. And so I appreciate you taking the time to spend it with us today, to teach about these moments, but commit to coming back to us with more. So I'll turn it back to the MTS staff. Thank you. I think.
Am I unmuted?
You're good.
I'm still muted. Can everyone hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Technical difficulties at the end of the presentation. But thank you, David, Katrina, and Mike for this informative session. We really, truly appreciate your ongoing work on youth homelessness prevention. And we look forward to hearing about your results, Dr. Milaney and Mike. And we hope everyone enjoyed this webinar. If anyone wants to further engage with the Shelter Diversion Program or the Niagara Resource Service for Youth, also known as RAFT, you can access their website at theraft.ca or contact Mike at mike@theraft.ca. This contact information is listed in the chat box. Additionally, if anyone's interested in the work of Making the Shift, they can access our website at makingtheshiftinc.ca or contact us at makingtheshift@yorku.ca. Both are listed in the chat box. Thank you again to our guests and attendees, and apologies for the technical difficulties. And we hope everyone has a great afternoon and evening. Thank you.